Great.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone. It is straight up 8 a.m. here in Long Beach, California, but our host today is far away from where I'm located. So Kostas, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and we'll get started.
Thank you very much. My name is Kostas Kamporakis. I'm a science educator who works in Geneva, Switzerland. So the time here is 5 p.m. and I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very glad to see you all. The idea for this webinar was to initiate a discussion. So I'm going to make a presentation in the beginning about what I think, I think we should be thinking and discussing about literacy related to evolution. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I will ask you to write your response in the chat so that I can get the general idea of what you think. And Lisa, if we could also say the chat, it would be useful. And then during the second hour, we're going to ask you to work in breakout rooms in small groups and answer the question that I'm going to ask in the end. What should we do? Because this is something about which I have no answer. I'm going, in other words, to identify a problem, and I would like to initiate a discussion about how we might address it. I would very much like to thank Lisa, who has been very helpful along the way, and Renee and everyone at NORST for letting me do this webinar, especially as I'm still unable to come to the conference because of all these restrictions. I'm not too worrying about getting sick, but I'm worrying about getting stuck somewhere because of a positive test. Let's hope that next year it will work. So if I may begin, I'm going to share my screen. And I hope that you can all see my presentation. Is it okay? Great.
That looks great.
So my title is Reconsidering the Goals of Evolution Education, which means that I'm implying that something is not well thought, well done. And the first step, in my view, would be to define evolution and evolutionary literacy, two different kinds of literacy that I think we should clearly distinguish between, especially in teacher education. And then the second part of today's discussion will be what we can do to achieve that. So I'm going to begin with a question for you. Could you please write in your chat your thoughts about what is, in general, the goal of teaching evolution in schools? What do we want to achieve with that? Perhaps we can take a few minutes so that you can write your responses. Provide a framework for making sense of much for life sciences, allow students to understand the world around them, have a deep understanding of biological processes and concepts, a general principle to understand the world, fundamental concept in biology that students need to understand, people mention also the nature of science, which is related. Again, biological evolution is foundational to many of the other biology concepts. We can have a few more minutes if necessary for people to share their thoughts. I see more responses here. Use as organizing concept for biology. Take informed decisions about practical matters such as antibiotic use, vaccination, consumption of food. Better understand the natural world. So all in all, and not surprisingly, many of you agree that teaching evolution is something fundamental for understanding the life sciences and life more broadly. And of course, I cannot agree more. So I think that what we need to do is to think more clearly about the specific aims that we have. And this is the overview of my talk. I'm going to begin with a distinction that I find very useful between science literacy and scientific literacy, and then apply these two concepts to evolution, defining what I call evolution and evolutionary literacy. And the fourth part, which will be your own work and our work together in the breakout rooms to see what exactly we can do to teach. I will make some suggestions, but what I would like to see is more ideas from your experiences, from what you have seen, from what you have done. So I begin with the definitions. In a now classic and widely cited chapter by Douglas Roberts, there is a distinction between two visions of scientific science literacy, which, according to him, represent the extremes of a continuum. We have, on the one hand, vision one, literacy relevant to the products and processes of science itself, which he described as literacy within science, and vision two, which is literacy relevant to situations with scientific component that students are likely to encounter as citizens. In other words, literacy about science-related situations in which considerations other than science have an important place at the table. A few years later, along with Roger Bybee, they revised these definitions, and they described vision one as literacy, again, within science, general familiarity and fluency within the discipline based on mastering and sampling of the language, products, processes, and traditions of science itself. And vision two are something that looks outside science, how science fits with the personal and societal perspectives. They noted that there are four reasons for using vision one as default, which means beginning with that. Historically, vision one has been the dominant model for the curriculum. I think it still is today in many cases. Vision two measures are more complex as those of vision one, because in the second case, we may also have to measure attitudes, not just conceptual understanding. Vision two might seem as too broad to be taught at schools, and perhaps many among you will think that too. And vision two requires that teachers master new content, teaching styles, and kind of discourse, which is exactly the problem I want us to consider, discuss, and perhaps resolve in the near future. In that chapter, they write exactly what you see here. Our review suggests to us there is more need than ever to develop ways to balance science literacy, vision one, and scientific literacy in science education programs that can successfully meet the needs of students. And this is actually the only place where I've seen this distinction made explicitly between science and scientific literacy. So based on that, I think we can distinguish between two types of literacy relevant to science. Science literacy, which is relevant to processes and products of science. We can describe it shortly as literacy about issues within science. And scientific literacy, which is literacy relevant to questions that students may encounter as citizens and to the socio-ethical implications of scientific knowledge, which is literacy about the implications of science for society. If we apply these to evolutionary biology, then we can have evolution literacy, which I define here as literacy relevant to processes and products of evolutionary biology, for instance, learning about natural selection, and evolutionary literacy, which is literacy relevant to questions that students may encounter as citizens and to the socio-ethical implications of scientific knowledge, as we saw, for instance, understand the evolution of SARS-CoV-2 or why vaccination is necessary to achieve what we want, the end of the pandemic. So in other words, I apply the concept of science literacy to evolutionary biology, and I call it evolution literacy. and I apply the concept of scientific literacy to evolutionary biology, calling it evolutionary literacy. And this is the distinction I would like us to discuss today. In short, we can think of evolutionary literacy as literacy in or within evolutionary biology or theory, and evolutionary literacy, literacy about evolutionary biology theory with whatever implications exist for society. And obviously, I consider evolution literacy as a subset of evolutionary literacy because, and this is something that also research has shown, in order to be able to have scientific literacy, in order to be able to make decisions or apply scientific knowledge to societal issues, we first need to understand the concepts, the explanations, the theories of science. And so science literacy is necessary for scientific literacy, and in the same sense, evolutionary literacy is part and also a prerequisite for evolutionary literacy, in my view. Let us now see what each of these are and what they comprise. Another question for you. What does evolution literacy comprise in your view? Please take a few minutes in the chat to provide your thoughts, share your thoughts. So, understanding of the fundamental mechanism by which populations of organisms change over time, history of life, evidence of evolution, mechanism of evolution, evolution explanations, core concepts of evolution, understanding evolutionary processes, fossil record, ability to apply and describe the concepts and processes related to evolution, the role of mutation, basic principles and ideas such as variation, natural selection, explaining again how diversity of life arose. Excellent. So overall, you have correctly identified the main issues, the main topics to discuss. It's about concepts, it's about understanding, it's about explanations. Let us see that in some more detail. So you all know, I assume, that there is an emphasis on adaptation when we come to the teaching of evolution. And you have seen in textbooks, but also in documentary films, that there is a representation of beautifully adapted organisms in the environments they live. And actually, there are studies of these documentaries showing that teleology, in the sense of design, or that something is beautifully designed for a role or a purpose, is something that is actively promoted in these films. And for instance, what they show is that, what they imply usually is that in the same way that this soldier here used his uniform to conceal himself, in the same sense, this animal here, this frog here, has the color necessary for survival in that environment. So the first thing to do is to document students' preconceptions, which unfortunately relate to what I've just presented. For instance, there's a lot of research showing that students, especially in schools, think that organisms will acquire whatever they need for their survival and reproduction, especially if there's sufficient time. Give students time and everything is possible in the way that you see here. Sometimes they think that organisms can intentionally adapt to their environments, and I very much like this book, How to Avoid Natural Selection, that this folk here is reading. There is the notion of design, which is unfortunately used by scientists in a metaphorical sense. However, the metaphor is not always explained to students. And so in order to challenge students' preconceptions, we have to show them that not all things are perfectly adapted and nothing is beautifully designed, and that there are various ways that organisms can adapt to their environments. Concealment is one way, but there may be other properties for animals to survive, or some may not be adapted at all. An example I used to use when I was a teacher was that in a documentary film where this whale was swimming with her baby, and I asked my students, why do they have hydrodynamic shapes? The answer always was in order to swim fast underwater. And then these guys appeared and tried to separate the mother from the baby. Eventually, they push the baby down to the water until it's drawn. And I asked the students, okay, they have hydrodynamic shapes, but why don't they have gills and they have lungs instead, and they cannot breathe underwater? And this is the point where students begin to realize that not all things are perfectly designed. And this is a simple example of a situation of conceptual conflict that we can use to make students reconsider their preconceptions. Another important issue is to make the distinction between organisms and artifacts. We can always say that airplanes have wings in order to fly because they are designed for this purpose, but this is not the case for animals, not even all birds, because there are birds that have wings that do not fly. Once we do that, we can look at the evidence for evolution. Since 1863, Thomas Huxley pointed out the similarities in the skeletons between humans and our closest relatives. And later on, we were able to identify similarities at the level of chromosomes and realize that our chromosome 2 is the outcome of a fusion at some point of evolution of other chromosomes that we see in the apes. And overall, wherever we look today, be it comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, comparative genomics, or the basics of cellular and molecular biology, the only thing we see is that there is evidence for evolution from common ancestry, common ancestry being the main theme of our evolutionary process. After we discuss the evidence, we should teach concepts, and here I show you the table of contents of my book just because it summarizes the most important concepts in my view: the evolution network of life, homology and common descent, homoplasy and convergence, something about evo-devo, adaptation, natural selection, stochastic events and processes, speciation, extinction, macroevolution, or evolution explanations and the historicity of nature. These are familiar, these are usually taught, and these are important prerequisites for understanding evolution. Of course, there are tricky issues. For instance, if you look at definitions of adaptation, there are historical definitions that focus on path selection, no matter if selection takes place now or not. And so in many textbooks, historical definitions of adaptation exists on the basis that something is an adaptation if it has been selected in the past. These are mostly used by philosophers, but biologists usually prefer historical definitions and say that adaptation is something that exists, that takes place now, no matter if it happened in the past or not. And this is a simple example of conceptual variation that might be perceived as incoherence by students, because these are definitions you can actually find in the same textbook. So here we have to be careful. Then, of course, we have to teach explanations. And as many students think, if we ask them how these green and brown beetles, this population of green and brown beetles turn to a population of brown ones only, they will usually say that because of need, plan, purpose, design, the green ones became brown in order to survive. However, as we all know, there's a simpler natural explanation, natural selection. In that brown environment, the green ones were more visible, and so it was easier for the predators to spot them and eat them. And in the end, it was only the brown ones that survived. Explanation should be about microevolution and microevolutionary processes where we can have natural selection, drift, or nothing at all. But we should also not forget macroevolution and the important concepts that we have at that level, above the level of species. We can also think about threshold concepts, and I like very much this work where it becomes evident that it's not only about the biological concepts, but also about other concepts like randomness, probability, scales in space and time. These are crucial for students to understand in order to be able to understand evolution. And you can see here very well elaborated work about how these can be connected to one another. My contribution in that would be the concept of contingency. As you can see, I wrote a whole book about this, about the idea that there are events that are contingent per se, that is unpredictable, but once they occur, all future events are contingent upon them because they depend on them. And the key idea here is that we usually look at individual outcomes without realizing that there are many other unrealized outcomes because we try to explain what happened in hindsight. But if we could go back in time with a thought experiment, we might be able to see that the actual outcome is only one among various possible unrealized outcomes. And this might help us reject altogether notions of design and purpose in nature. Then we move to teaching about the nature of science. We all know that there are gaps in our understanding of evolution. Also, we all know that scientists sometimes debate different hypotheses. And whereas these are presented by anti-evolutionists as problems, that we do not have all the evidence we need, or that science is in crisis, we all know that these are normal things that happen in science. And here's an actual example of the tree that you saw previously. Our current knowledge about human evolution is fragmented. We have fossils. Each column here represents the fossils and how much they spread across time. But we do not know all the details about how these species or genera relate to one another. And as Bernard Wood has written, we know too little and are always likely to know too little to be sure where, when, and how modern humans originated. But this means that we do not know, or perhaps cannot know, all the details. However, this does not question the fact of evolution. My favorite representation of a nature of science topic, how scientists perceive and interpret data. I liked very much the one here. You see, it is very important to explain to students that data say nothing on their own. Interpretation and how they become evidence under a specific theoretical framework is crucial. And of course, we have to remember that evolution and evolutionary theory is not religion. It's something that we should critically question, as we do for all science, and not dogmatically accept. So overall, I think that evolution literacy comprises at least these topics: addressing preconceptions that students have, and then teach about the evidence for evolution, concepts, explanations, nature of science, and threshold concepts. I would very much like to see later on what else you have to add in the slides on which we're going to ask you to write your thoughts after your work in the breakout rooms, or perhaps tell us why you disagree with some of the topics that I chose. Let us now see what evolutionary literacy is. And before I tell you what I think, please take a few minutes to write your thoughts, what evolutionary literacy comprises on the chat. Ability to apply evolution to address problems, absolutely. Apply evolutionary tools to make informed decisions, reason about contemporary issues, intervene in the natural world, give context for socio-moral issues, contextualizing evolution with social issues, excellent. So you all agree, obviously, that evolution literacy is what we ought to know and be able to do. Then evolutionary literacy has to be, what exactly do we do with this kind of knowledge and how we use it for societal issues? I think there are two important elements in evolutionary literacy. And the first one is the one we usually address. The second one is the most difficult, which I think we ought to address, but we usually do not. So the first one is apply evolution literacy to everyday life socio-scientific issues. And let us see how the various elements I just presented could be used for this purpose. There is a long discussion for years about argumentation and students' ability to make decisions or to develop arguments about socio-scientific issues. You all know the classical example of Toulmin's theory. There are others. I don't want to say much on that. Obviously, we have to teach concepts. So what is the coronavirus? How does it reproduce inside our cells? We have all heard about herd immunity for the past 2 years. Students should be obviously able to understand what this is about. But also we need to use this to understand, for instance, the headlines. So these are headlines of almost 2 years ago about the notion, the idea that the coronavirus could have been the product of research about making a biological weapon. And here one might think, if I wanted to do a biological weapon, should I use, for instance, a virus or a bacterium, which is more resistant? I don't know. But the idea is that students should be able to use their knowledge and understanding of viruses and bacteria and everything to critically consider headlines like this. Then we have the evidence of evolution, for evolution. Very early on, there were papers published that showed that those versions of SARS-CoV-2 that existed at the time could have emerged naturally through natural processes of natural evolutionary processes. And here you see one study and another that shows that it is not a surprise to have something like that. And actually there were studies since 2003, since the SARS epidemic, that were saying that there's a large reservoir of virus in the area and we should be ready to deal with the pandemic, which unfortunately did not happen as well as we would have liked. Then we have explanations. And here I show you a graph from here in Switzerland. We're talking about antibiotic resistance, and students should be able to apply their knowledge and understand that bacteria are not smart, as the virus is not smart to adapt to whatever we're using, but this is just a natural process that occurs whenever we're using antibiotic resistance to kill most of the bacteria that are there. There may exist some which are resistant anyway, and these are going to become the prevalent ones in the population. We also have nature of science. Here I show you something you may have watched, the debate between Midnight, the science guy, and Ken Ham. And this is from Ken Ham's presentation, where he's obviously a creationist, and he argues that we have a battle over the same evidence. Both creation and evolution are theories using the same evidence. And eventually, it is a matter of interpretation. However, if we look in detail at the thought processes, and this is something that we ought to explain to students, and is very relevant to the nature of science, they're not exactly the same. And I like very much this cartoon. The creationist method says, here's the conclusion, what facts can we find to support it? And usually what they do is that they begin from a conclusion, they find data to support their conclusion, and so the data become evidence for the theory, which turns back to support the conclusion. Whereas, you know, the scientific method, the scientific thought processes are different. We have data that become evidence under a theoretical framework, and we may arrive at different conclusions. And then with additional data, we might be able to choose one of the conclusions or the explanations, or perhaps not. In other words, there are no pre-reached conclusions. Things are open to criticism and discussion in science, as you know. Regarding the threshold concept, one of the arguments of creationists and evolutionists is that how is it possible for complex organs like the eye to have evolved randomly? And the answer is that they have not evolved randomly. They have evolved gradually along billions of years from simpler structures to what we see today, as you see in this simple representation here. Now, I think that this is something that we all do. However, the problem with evolutionary theory, in my view, is that it allows inferences that may impact one's worldviews. And this is the big problem that I would like to discuss today. I think that teachers are not well prepared to deal with these issues, and I'm going to show you just two examples and how they might be addressed. For instance, we enter a classroom and a student says that evolution entails atheism because that student read the books that you see here by Richard Dawkins. What are we going to do with that? This is something that requires not only a solid understanding of science, evolutionary science, and all the issues that I've just presented, but requires a broader knowledge. And here you see, for example, a study that shows overall that acceptance of evolution is higher when students do not perceive it as being atheistic. Those who perceive it as being atheistic inherently have a lower acceptance. Now, my answer to this would be that within science, we can find different views. We can find Richard Dawkins, for instance, Stephen Jay Gould, and Simon Conway Morris, representing respectively atheism, agnosticism, and religiosity. Three very different views along a continuum. And I'm not saying that these are the only three positions. There may be different ones in between. For instance, Dawkins talks about the illusion of design in nature and argues that atheism nearly always indicates a healthy independence of mind, and that any kind of religion is problematic. At the other extreme, Conway Morris wrote that science is good, but not enough. If we want to understand who we are, where we come from, and where we go, we need to use both theology and science for a fuller understanding. And Stephen Jay Gould famously wrote that these are two enterprises that cover different needs. He was not religious, but he understood the need for religion, and he accepted that. So to summarize, regarding the existence of God, for Dawkins it's improbable, for Gould unknowable, for Conway Morris probable. The question on the existence of God for Dawkins was scientific, for Gould we cannot answer, and for Conway Morris it was theological. The status of religion for humans, unimportant and unnecessary for Dawkins, important for Gould and necessary for Conway Morris, and relation between religion and science, conflict, coexistence, and unification. So here you see how three evolutionary biologists who all agreed about the fact of evolution, of course they disagreed in the details, draw different conclusions from their own worldviews. And I think that this is something natural. And this is something that we have to share with students, in my view. For instance, if we look at polls, we see that, for instance, in the United States, scientists overall are less religious than the general public, but there are still religious scientists, and there are many. This is a nice study by Elaine Eklund, who showed that in a large sample of 1,646 scientists, about half said that they were affiliated with a religion. And then in a subsequent study with more than 2,000 scientists in various countries, they found that there are more religious scientists than commonly thought. The majority in Italy, Turkey, India, and Taiwan, 1/3 in USA, UK, France, and Hong Kong. They also found that atheist scientists generally respect religion, and that the idea that religion and science must conflict is primarily an invention of the West. And of course, you probably know that there are very famous religious scientists that have written whole books, Francis Collins and Ken Miller. They're devout Christians and nevertheless accept what science tells us. So these are some examples that science and religion can coexist. And having said that, I have to tell you that I find myself somewhere between Gould and Dawkins. So this is not my personal belief, but when the evidence shows that there are scientists who are religious, then we have to arrive at the conclusion that the evidence shows. There are people who believe that both are useful, both can coexist, and this is a very important message to convey. Another example for the inference that we make about our lives, our worldviews from evolutionary theory. And this is even more interesting in my view. This is what has been called scientific or biological racism, a view that was developed especially in the 19th century, when physicians and anthropologists thought that there were higher races, the Europeans, that have characteristic craniometric features which show that they were better developed than Aborigines in Australia or Africans, who, not a coincidence here, look to be more similar, although distinct from apes. This is a view that has been described as essentialism, and we know today that from psychological research that we have to deal with psychological essentialism, which consists of a set of particular beliefs, that particular categories distinguish between fundamentally different kinds of people, that the boundaries that separate these categories are strict and absolute, making the groups discrete or non-overlapping, that the individuals within the categories are physically and behaviorally homogeneous, and that variation within and between groups is due to internal factors, essences, this is our DNA usually, that are shared within a group and which differ categorically across groups. And what psychologists tell us is that this essentialism has two distinct functions when it comes to social groups. It has a cohesion function, so it defines who we are and how we are different from the others, a distinction between us and them, as you see here, and also a discriminatory function between distinguishing different groups from one another. So, in other words, essentially help us have strengthen the in-group to which we believe and differentiate ourselves from out groups, from the groups in which we do not believe. Now, the problem is that whereas most scientists would say that there are no races and that these notions of biological racism do not have any scientific basis, there are results from population genetics. This is a program called Structure that show that we can find under certain conditions, especially if you see this line here, distinct clusters, genomic clusters that correspond to the 5 continents. And this is something that has been interpreted as such. And some geneticists, such as David Reich at Harvard, has said that, yes, there are distinct human populations. The problem is that such findings can be misused by people who believe that there are biological differences among humans. And such a book was written by journalist Nicholas Wade, who said that all science, like the study I showed you earlier, points to the conclusion that there are distinct biological races. And this is interesting, even though the same authors in a subsequent study explicitly said that our evidence for clustering should not be taken as evidence of our support of any particular concept of biological race. Now, the problem here is that what these graphs show, if you take a small piece here and you zoom in, this is an individual, and these four colors are the different ancestries assigned to that individual. And the problem is fundamentally scientific here. The problem is that whenever we define ancestries and we talk about admixture, it is very nice to say that we are all admixed. However, admixture as a concept requires the existence of pure categories, because even if we're all admixed, in order to be able to figure out this admixture, we have to be able to define distinct groups, like the groups that you see here, which, however, if you look at the way scientists do this, it is entirely arbitrary. Usually it works on the continental level, but these are arbitrary categories that depend on the assumptions and the parameters of the model that the scientists use. And unfortunately, this is also the case in the various ancestryDNA tests, which provide admixture results. And of course, this might seem clear and straightforward. However, there are many cases of people who took tests with different companies and received different results. Why? Because they have different reference populations and different algorithms for calculating the results. And actually, some go as far as to find fundamental groups, as you can see here, how much of you is Native American, hunter-gatherer, farmer, South Asian, Yamnaya, East Asian, and African. And I was very impressed by that, where this shows that being Greek, I would be able to confirm my ancient Greek origins, even though the studies of population genetics show that there's no way we can establish anything before a few generations or a few hundred years ago. So the problem with all this is that they rely on science to make claims about distinct human social groups, even though the evidence does not really support that. And I like this quote by Patrick Geary, who says that history has been complex, populations have been migrating, not of course at the pace they do today, but they have been migrating a lot. And of course, it is not possible to make the distinction we want to make today between human social groups, because all human social groups are socially constructed. And this is confirmed by science. These are studies that show that most variation among humans, you see different studies. Since 1972, a landmark study by Richard Leontin until more recently, they show that most variation is found within human groups, and just a small portion of variation is found between continental regions, which means that whereas we usually think that human genetic variation is like this, distinct continental groups or races, this is actually what we find from the analysis of DNA. And the great work by Brian Donovan has shown that if we actually teach this to students, we can help them reduce their views of genetic essentialism and perhaps also their racial biases. And the aim here would be to arrive at the conclusion that all humans are family. So what I wanted to say is that I think we cover evolution literacy. And I think we also cover evolutionary literacy up to this point, but I'm very concerned that this one, we do not address it as much, not only because it's difficult to do, but also because it requires extensive reading and understanding and knowledge by teachers, something that we do not provide to them. And so, in closing, my question for you today would be, what does teacher education require in order for teachers to be able to be competent to teach towards evolutionary and evolutionary literacy, especially with respect to the worldviews issue that I raised? And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have before we move to the breakout rooms.
If you have a question, go ahead and in the reactions, you can raise your hand. You can also put your questions in the chat. Kostas, I also noticed that there were some interesting ideas about additional studies that people are mentioning in the chat.
I didn't have the time to read that, but I will read it carefully. I see that someone is asking to share my slides. I would be happy to. I'm not sure, Lisa, I assume we can do this somehow.
Yeah, I will look into that. Of course, you can email Kostas and ask for the slides there too. Isabel, I see you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kostas, for the interesting talk. I wanted to ask why you would say that nature of science is part of the evolution literacy and not of evolutionary literacy.
Well, that's a good question. I think that nature of science is something fundamental in teaching science, but this is my personal view. It's not an add-on as we usually describe it. I think that whenever we teach content, whenever we do anything we do typically in science, there are nature of science elements. And so teaching should be done explicitly at the same time. For instance, students go and do lab work. There are nature of science messages there that are implicit. So all in all, it is my personal view that nature of science teaching is part of, should be part of the mainstream science teaching, not an add-on. But of course, I know that it's very difficult to do it explicitly in appropriate way all the time.
So is there a specific order that you think that evolution literacy and evolutionary literacy are treated in class? So I understood you, or if I understood you correctly, then you said that nature of science is just part of understanding evolution, but for me it would be more like a meta knowledge about how to apply evolutionary theory. And then I would say that maybe we teach a mixture between evolution literacy and evolutionary literacy, that maybe we also need to explain nature of science to the students, even though it already is evolutionary literacy.
Yeah, I understand what you say. My personal experience and my personal understanding of what I've read is that there is no real understanding of evolutionary theory without nature of science, because many of the misunderstandings that are out there relate to the nature of science, especially when it comes to evolution. That's why I think it is essential and it should be part of evolutionary literacy. But this is my view, and that's my personal experience. I wouldn't object to include it in evolutionary literacy as at a meta level, as we say. It could work. It is just that I strongly believe that it is essential.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Kostas, you can either choose a question from the chat or call on our next person with their hands raised.
It's difficult to do both at the same time. So I see Kadia is the first one from what I see, and then Jacob. Yes, please.
Yes, my question, these issues that you raised about biological essentialism, are there resources for teachers that are available that, so I train pre-service teachers, that I could maybe give to my teachers to help them teach this in their classrooms?
Yes, there's a lot of research on what we call genetic essentialism. This comes mostly from psychologists, but the first thing I would urge you to read is the work of Brian Donovan, which is explicitly related to the teaching of genetics and genomics in schools. There are several papers in the Journal of Research and Science Teaching and Science Education about his view, what he calls humane genomics education, and the related research to that. I think this would be the best thing to look at as a first point. And then, of course, there are books about broader issues. There's a nice book by Stephen Heine, DNA is Not Destiny, it's called. As you may have shown, I just finished a book about ancestry and ethnicity in which I deal with these issues. But when it comes to teaching teachers, educating teachers, I think Brian's work is fantastic for this purpose.
Okay, and I'm sorry, can you give me that name again?
Brian Donovan. I can write it in the chat.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Something we could do if you're interested is, Kostas, if you could put together maybe a list of some of your resources, and I can email those out to all of our participants.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jacob is next.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the, thanks for kind of setting the stage here. And, the question I'm going to pose perhaps is exactly where you are wanting us to head. And I think that as you were talking through all these things, I think everybody here, can kind of agree that like, oh yeah, this stuff is worth addressing. This stuff is worth addressing. This stuff is, and it's the infinite proliferation, right? And we know full well that like really it's a question of like, what's the depth of knowledge needed to deal with the sorts of things that evolutionary literacy demands. And it's all fine and good for all of us to sit here and spin out all the various things, but then the teacher in the classroom, like why don't they teach X, Y, and Z? Why doesn't nature of science get taught? Well, we know why. Because they prioritize something else. So how do again, that might be the question you're going to try to send on us. I suspect it is, but I'm interested to kind of get your initial take on it, I guess.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. That's a question I want to ask. I have no answer because there's no easy answer. If you ask me, I work with teachers and I have only one session, one day on evolution, only one day with the biology teachers, because I have to do other things and some broader things across the whole year. And that's why I thought of this discussion, because there's no easy answer. And because, as you say, this is indefinite. I mean, we can talk for days about what is important to teach. I'm hoping that, a common reflection might point to, a direction which is realistic, pragmatic, and might work. Because if you ask me, what should I prioritize? I cannot say. My main point is that I think we usually do evolution literacy, the concepts and explanations and everything. We may bring in some societal issues, but I think the question of worldviews is crucial. And this is at the same time important and very difficult to address because it also has to do with the personal beliefs of teachers. I'm showing to my teachers an example from a biology teacher who works at the canton of Vaud in Lausanne at a private religious school, where he says that I do not teach evolution because it goes contrary to the reason for which the parents brought the kids to this school. And that's a real problem for him to deal with. So these are not, there are no simple answers. And that's why I want to initiate a discussion about if this is important, and I assume that most of people would agree that these are important. How can we do that in practice? I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, it's
now the challenge is for you to answer my question.
Exactly. No, and again, that's kind of where I suspected where we were headed. So,
I don't know, something. I think we have 5 more minutes before we go to the breakout rooms.
You can either do a quick break and or we can go ahead and move into breakout rooms now. And everyone's adults here. You can take breaks as needed. But if you're ready, we can go ahead.
I think that we can. So what we're going to do is that Lisa kindly set up a nice page with slides. And as far as I can see, here we have now 42 people. So we might make groups of 5 people and make, I don't know, 6, 7 breakout rooms. And I'm going to delete the other slides. So, okay, so you can just use the slide that corresponds to the number of your breakout room. Lisa, have we put that there?
And how many slides are you going to use? 10?
I think I'm going to use 7.
Okay. No
because I see 36 people. So yes, we can.
Yes. So what would you like them to do with their slides?
Okay. Yes. So before, that's a good point. There was a question And what I would like to do is for 30 minutes to discuss among yourselves in small groups, which would be the priorities, which should be the priorities in this. And if you decide that dealing with the implications for worldviews is a priority, how we can deal with that. So the slides should only include in the end some key points for us to discuss in the end. So I'm going to give you 30 minutes for reflection. And
Like
then,
Kostas,
yes,
if you don't mind, let's start with 15 and see how they're doing. They may
Okay.
not need 30 minutes total.
absolutely. And then the idea is to have a discussion. The slides are there just for you to write your thoughts and share it with the others. And then I would very much like to listen to you and sharing your thoughts among ourselves. Sounds
Great.
good?
Okay, so I'm making the rooms. And if you would say it one more time, our task is.
The task is to answer the question that I showed at the end of my presentation, what we should do in teacher preparation in order for teachers to be confident and able to teach for evolution and evolutionary literacy. Obviously, I'm concerned about the parts I think we do not successfully address. The last part that has to do with worldviews. So the idea is that once you discuss among yourselves in the breakout rooms, you write your thoughts, your main ideas, your main suggestions on the slides that everyone can see. And then we're going to have a discussion. I would say that each group can briefly present for a few minutes what they think and listen to the questions of the others.
Great. All right. Thank you for clarifying that again. I put the question kind of badly written in the chat. And here we go with our breakout rooms.
So should I do it, Lisa, or will you do it? It's already
They
done.
are
Okay.
doing it. No
Okay,
problem.
Excellent.
I'm going to pause the recording.
So we have 6 groups. Great. I assume you can see the slides, can't you?
Yeah, it looks
Yeah.
great.
Okay. Okay, let's wait until we're back.
All right. It looks like we have everyone back with us. Glad to see you here. You guys were having some great discussions from what I heard in a couple of groups that I stopped in to chat with. One of the things that I've heard people say that they really appreciate is for people to share their resources and other teaching ideas. So feel free to put those in the chat at any time. You can save the chat. It will also be on this webinar that we are recording, so you can come back here again if you would like to on our NARST YouTube channel where we will be posting this. So without further ado, let's take a look at the ideas that you have to share.
So I think we can begin with group 1, and we'll look forward to listening to you. We see your slides, and the idea is to share your thoughts and have a discussion among ourselves.
Yeah. So we had a lot of thoughts. As you can see, we have like kind of a protocol of our discussion, but at the end we had 2 points that stood out, and the first one was that we all had the opinion that nature of science is really important to like prepare teachers for the teaching, for the school service, and that it's kind of like the yeah, that is the essential part of the preparation process. Again, I would argue that I would see it more in the evolutionary literacy, because I think that the evolution literacy is more like the philosophy of evolution. So when I think about processes of evolution, then it's like the method to think in terms of evolutionary concepts and in terms of threshold concepts. And I would see the philosophy of science and to think like a scientist, that for me, that is evolutionary literacy. But then we can argue later. Our second point was that we think that the framework is really valuable for the teacher preparation, because when you have like the figure that you showed in the end, I would find it really helpful if the teacher preparation would like use this framework to structure the ideas that we have, or the concepts that evolution literacy and evolutionary literacy tackle, so that teachers can have like kind of a checklist which topics are all involved with evolution education. And they also have a framework to determine where problems in understanding comes from. So when a student, for example, we had the example that students could not interpret the data that they have to recognize variation, for example. So then we can see, is it a lack of understanding variation? So is it a problem of evolution literacy, or is it a problem of nature of science, that students don't understand how to use data? So then it would be, for me, it would be a part of evolutionary literacy. However, it would be the problem with the nature of science. So then you have like more of a framework to know where the problem area is, to identify the problem area, and also to like structure your topics around this framework, so that you choose different topics and different example to cover it all, and yeah, to tackle every area, instead of like shooting in all directions and maybe get some hits at the concepts, but yeah, but don't have like a really guided idea of what you're doing.
Great. Someone else from the group has anything to add?
Or questions for this group too.
Or questions for the group? Absolutely, yes.
I just want to add, as a pragmatic thing, I found it useful to start with microevolution, especially if you're dealing with religious people who might be resistant to the concept. And then from that, you can move on to macroevolution.
That's an interesting point. I was once talking with a high school teacher who said she even began teaching about the concepts within evolution and wrote them all on the board. But she hadn't been calling them evolution with the E word, right? So she put all of these concepts on the board that they've been learning about. And she said, you agree with this? They're like, yeah, no problem. You agree with this. And then at the end, she writes evolution. And she said, this is what evolution is. These are the main ideas. And I thought that was an interesting approach also.
But for me, this would also be a point that you can base on your framework. So if you have, for example, the threshold concepts, then you can have a look for example, which organizational scale do you want to use first? So do you have a class that is really interested in dinosaurs and macroevolution? Then you can maybe start with the macroevolution, because they already accept evolutionary theory and are not creationists. If you have a really creationist class, then you can start with the microevolution, which is not very controversial topic. So I would argue again that then you can use the framework at least as a guideline, and that you can in every section you can make a decision how to tackle this area.
Knowing your students.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Is there any other question for this group? Any comment? Great. So Lisa, perhaps we can go to group 3.
Absolutely.
So the people in group 3, room 3, please.
Hi. So we spoke a lot about the difficulties for the students as well, and then I suppose the main themes that came out for us was that you need to have this sort of problems, the sort of situations and scenarios that will really engage the students, but also those scenarios that will make them aware that it's not as simple as it seems. And correct me, who was in the room was saying about the idea of the skin pigmentation, and we also had a situation of where they were breeding foxes and there was unforeseen outcomes. The other people in the room might remember those. So that this that can also, again, it's the nature of science. They can also say this is what that this is what on the surface of it looks like it's X, Y, and Z, but actually the outcomes are different. And why is that? One of the thought was that yes, these threshold concepts for many of the science teachers are just they're so embedded they don't realize, they maybe are not aware that they've got to really explicitly teach these, and again in engaging ways, games with dice for probability and things like that. And also I think that at the other side it's making the teachers aware of their own misconceptions, that they really especially if they think, oh, I've been teaching evolution for donkey's years, I know everything. Yes, but not actually realize that it's their own misconceptions they might be teaching. I'm a primary school background, that's my area, and that it's the misconceptions that the teachers have are quite stark. And I think that when it comes to supporting the teachers in their own education, it's going to be the quality. Yes, we've got the framework, but it's going to be sort of quality, maybe learning progressions, but that are really practical. They're not something that they've got to sit down and analyze. Again, I'm coming at it from more of a primary school teacher approach, where there's just not the time to sit down. It's something that's really clear and simple, that they can apply to their classroom, along with these interesting examples. I suppose it comes down to resources for teachers. So yeah, please, anybody else in the room that wants to add to that.
Thank you. Someone else from the room to add anything?
Yeah, I think that most students are interested in the world around them, and you can use exciting examples to create cognitive dissonance amongst them. For example, if you want to bring up issues of religion and evolution and science, one example that I've used is most people are shocked to know that Charles Darwin is buried in Westminster Abbey. So you tell them that, and you say, now, why do you think he's buried in a Christian church? And that opens the conversation on fundamentalist creationism or literal creationism, theism, agnostic, and all the rest of it. And then you can lead on from there. There are lots, and the foxes is fascinating too, how quickly it happened and how you have these foxes with droopy ears and black and white coats. There are just so many examples. Snakes with spider tails to attract birds. All those Darwin's, his flowers, what do you call them? Which just skips my mind, and the pollination of them, just simple ones. And then you can bring them into other avenues. In South Africa, skin color, of course, the adaptive nature of skin color, that it's adaptive, and then you can talk about race and that kind of stuff.
Great, thank you. Anyone else to add anything or ask a question? Okay, I think we can move to the next group. So that would be group 5. We're listening to you.
So it's us. Brandon was our spokesperson, but I think he left for another meeting. So basically, like we discussed those issues, like Kostas, like basically asked for us in this thing. But at the same time, like I like to start with this book that, you know, we were trying to explore those issues, like teaching about evolution, because like some conceptual understanding, some epistemic nature of science understandings and religious domain, and also social and political context. We were trying to explore those issues, how evolution is taught in 20 different countries around the world. So basically, these are like very important and very difficult discussions. Like when you are learning about evolution, it's not just like you are learning about evolution, but at the same time, it's about your identity. When you accept evolutionary theory, if you are coming from a religious framework, religious background, so basically it's about your status in the society. Maybe they are going to reject you. And when they say, like, when you accept evolution, maybe you fear that you are going to be like losing your religion. All these fears and all these things are very real, and then it's making our jobs very difficult. So 20 or 24 years ago, there was a book about teaching about evolution and nature of science by National Research Council. So I think that book did an excellent job in terms of like how to teach nature of science and evolution together. I think, you know, we need more resources like that, more up-to-date resources similar to that book. So I was trying to search for that book in my cabinet, but I couldn't find it. But, you know, I mean, if you are familiar with this area, basically that's the book that, you know, I was always referring back to. And I think we need to have more work similar to that, because it was also giving teachers like some kind of like pedagogical, you know, suggestions in terms of like how to teach evolution and how to approach teaching evolution when there's a student or family resistance to teaching about evolution. So I think we need to make those resources available, classroom ready to go, and also align with the current standards in a way that, you know, teachers are not spending a whole lot of time, but they have easy access to this kind of resources. So that's the gist of our discussion in our group.
Thank you. Lisa?
So you brought up some really great points. I had done a study with freshmen, first year college students who were learning about nature of science. And one of the things that they were surprised about is we had several of them say they had always felt that if they were going to believe, quote unquote, in evolution, and we unpack that you accept ideas of evolution. It's not a belief necessarily in terms of like a religious belief. But they felt pressure from themselves or things they perceived that they either had to believe in evolution or they could believe in their religious ideas. And after taking the course and learning about scientists who actually do have a spiritual side, that it's okay. Science teachers are not asking children to jettison all of their religious beliefs. But that was a fear they had. They were afraid that if they were going to accept evolution as this idea of how the world works, that they would have to get rid of their religious traditions and backgrounds and so forth. And so I think it's a really important thing in science classrooms to just, there are two things that I learned from that. One is allowing children, if you're talking, you know, K-12, to talk about their ideas or their worries or their concerns. Allow them to write about it. Research has shown that just allowing them to express their ideas that way can really help a lot in the classroom. And then us as science teachers verbally saying, we're going to be learning about science and how science works. You can have a spiritual side of your life. We're not asking you to give up any particular personal beliefs here, but we want you to understand how science works and the scientific way of knowing, and beginning that way and allowing them to feel like we're not attacking them is going to be important, at least in the classrooms I've had to work in the United States. So I see Isabel, I think, wants to add or ask a question too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. I found your commentary very, very valuable, because I also think that students can learn, and that we really have to make that clear, that students can learn how evolution works without like throwing overboard all the social aspects, or the social aspects, or all the aspects of religion. For example, if you think about love and falling in love, then there are scientists that would say, well, it's all pheromones, and it's like chemical processes that are in the body that happen in the body. But still, feeling in love is something different for people. So you can still have that feeling and still believe in something magical and the sparkling between two people, and also like think about it in terms of pheromones and chemical processes. So that does no harm to what for us is love. And I really like to think about evolution and learning about evolution, like practicing, like understanding how the philosophy of science, how it works. So just practicing so I studied philosophy for half a semester. So I'm not a professional in philosophy, but what really stick to me was that in the first semester, they always told us it's not to believe everything that the philosophers say, and it's not to argue against them. It's just to read their work and just to realize their argumentation, and to really deep dive into what they see as a valuable explanation, and how they are thinking. And if it's the ancient Greeks, it is very different to the argumentation structures that we use today. Also, like German philosophers, for example, have also really different view of the world, and their argumentation is also very exotic and from our thinking today, or from our everyday thinking. It's just practicing how they thought to expand your mind. And you can see learning about evolution as the same thing, that you're just practicing this scientific worldview, and you can use it. But when it's not valuable for you, for example, when you're in your religious community, then of course it's not valuable for you, and then you don't have to use it.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. What you said brings up an important distinction between conceptual obstacles and emotional obstacles to evolution, which is something that we should, I think, should not conflate, because it's not all about understanding. And historian Adam Latch once wrote on his Twitter account that Richard Dawkins is great, but asking him about creationism is like asking a cardiologist about heartbreak. And I think that points to the notion of emotional thinking, emotional obstacles, which are important for evolution. Anybody else? Okay, I think we can move to group 6. What's that? Room 5. Anyway, whoever did that, please, we'll listen to you.
Kostas, I think that was us. So I already
Okay,
talked
so
about this one.
who is that then?
And this is not us.
Okay.
This was our group. We were group 4.
Okay, we're listening to you. Sorry, I confused the slides.
So I kind of word jammed a lot of stuff here. So other folks who are in our room, please jump in. And our discussion overlapped with, I think, what a lot of you were talking about. But as I've listened to some of the themes from all of you, I mean, one thing that I'm thinking about a lot right now that came up in our room was sort of thinking about how preparing teachers for evolutionary literacy and to foreground that in their classrooms overlaps a great deal with preparing teachers more generally to foreground scientific literacy, which we know is quite hard to do. It's a paradigm shift for our teachers to do that. I mean, left to their own devices, you know, the safe route is to just stick to science literacy. Let me just get the content across and then call it good. So, so I think it bespeaks a bigger challenge here of how to make this sort of paradigm shift occur. And one question that I posed, and we had some interesting sort of thoughts on it, was just to actually look at our different science standards around the world, and people have done this, of course, to kind of see, like, is scientific literacy more generally and evolutionary literacy in particular actually starting to make its way into these policy documents that kind of guide things at a high level. So those are just a couple strands. Other folks, please jump in with kind of key thoughts.
Anyone else?
No, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Jacob, for bringing this up here in this group.
I think the point I read here, that our teachers do not necessarily have scientific literacy themselves, is spot on. That's a big issue. Any questions? Okay, I think we can go to this group here. Should be 7. Who is going to tell us?
Hello. So I will just first say that in our group we have people from who are in China, the Faroe Islands, Portugal, and the United States. So we have a really rich discussion, and well, we talked about the difficulties that some teachers could have in teaching about evolution. Normally they don't understand or have some constraints about it, so that's why they just don't talk about it, so it's more easy. And also it will be better to, or good to provide a better science background for those teachers and engage them in practical or hands-on activities to help them understand these concepts, and not just talk about about evolution just as a theory. So apply these concepts in the reality. We also discussed about the need to foster critical thinking to support students so they can evaluate science and religious perspectives on evolution. We also talk about to teach up-to-date research on evolution education, and also improve our curricula across countries. We also talk about the ways that we can include evolution literacy in the curriculum. So we have here this example from Faroe Islands, that they include information on coronavirus. And just to finish, we also talk about provide examples of current practical contexts, like the SSI that we talked before, in which teachers can address evolution in the classroom. So real and current problems like climate change, vaccination, so they can really understand why we need to learn about evolution. And I don't know if someone else wants to add something here.
Thank you. Anyone from the group who would like to add anything? I think the point about elementary teachers is very important. I used to say that dealing with evolution at the secondary school is too late, because there are misunderstandings which are fundamental. And my usual argument is that we need to begin, but I have no empirical evidence that this will work yet. We need to begin by explaining to students at kindergarten the distinction between organisms and artifacts, not the living, non-living. We should initially leave design out, distinguish between natural objects and artifacts, and among the natural objects, distinguish between living and non-living. Organisms on the one hand, and rocks, clouds, whatever on the other hand. This might help because the notion of design is so strongly held. As psychologists say, we grew up surrounded by artifacts, and perhaps we extrapolate this artifact thinking into nature. This might be a solution, but we have to see, because someone else said earlier that elementary teachers don't have the background to do that, and that's also a problem. Anybody wants to add anything else? Great, thank you. And then we go to the last group here. And could you please tell us who was there?
I think this was our group. Most of the points I think we have written down have already been mentioned, but I would like to link to the aspect Kostas stated, that it is very important that we teach already little children the concepts of natural selection, the concepts of evolution, as we see later on teaching, for example, university students, that the misconceptions are very deeply rooted, and even after a semester of teaching them about evolution, a lot of students still have those misconceptions. Yeah, so this is very important, and from teaching, I also know that a lot of pre-service teachers do not know a lot about evolution, and this is like a circle. They teach students again, and well, students will also learn misconceptions again. So I think we have to break up this circle. And I think a good point which was mentioned in our group is that it might help teachers to well, pair with scientists. So they see the passion in us teaching evolution, and maybe this will spark something in them as well. So maybe pairing them and teaching them how to do science, how to understand science, how to reflect on everything would help the teachers to get better at what they are doing. Okay, and then yes, another point would be to see evolution not only as a topic, but as an overarching principle, as we can see that evolution is the base for all those processes in everyday life, like vaccination or well, variation in species. So I think it's very important to well, teach the students every aspect of evolution within the everyday life. And then I think one of the last points is that that was mentioned already a lot of times today, that it is very important to promote a compatibilist attitude towards religion and evolution. So yeah, well, teachers and also students don't feel like evolution and religion have to be separated at all times. Yeah, and I think in Germany there's a field of studies which is called religious pedagogy, which tries to combine teaching evolution or teaching biology and teaching religion. Yeah, I think that's all. If anyone wants to jump in, please do so.
Absolutely. Anyone from the group?
So I would just add that I think what Helena said is really valuable, that we often talk about creation, but we yeah, oftentimes don't read the papers of religion, religious pedagogy. So maybe we could like make more interdisciplinary research with the expert, because like you said, Kostas, when we like consider Richard Dawkins to talk about creation, that might not be the right source to consider at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's also true, Lisa.
Thank you. And Jacob again asked a difficult question. How did we should go? Jacob, you want to tell us more about this? Because I think you're right.
Well, I think it's kind of the eternal question. I mean, from a lot of the conversations I've been hearing here, I mean, it's always, the solution always seems to be more, just do more stuff. But I'm sorry, folks, we can't do it. I mean, do we honestly think, especially let's think of our early grades teachers who have to deal with content from all sorts of different subject areas. Do we have a semester to go just mega deep into evolution and do all this great stuff? I mean, I wish we lived in that world, but we don't. So I think the hard part for us here is to figure out how do we, again, it's priorities, right? How the heck do we prioritize this stuff? Because it's all important. I agree with all of you. I just don't know how to cram it all in there.
You're absolutely right, but perhaps it's time for a change. Perhaps those who decide should give more time to this than other topics, especially if it's so crucial about, if you agree that religious worldviews and racism are important and influenced, is it perhaps time to reconsider the priorities? And of course, this would annoy many teachers of math and I don't know, languages or whatever. And of course, all topics are important. But when it comes to literacy, perhaps it's time to think about policy in general. And Xana, you raise your hand.
Yes, thank you very much. I was just thinking about what Jacob was saying and what the feedback that sometimes I also have here in Portugal about do you really want us to also teach this? And I feel that it's true, we are asking a lot to our teachers, especially to elementary school teachers who need to teach about everything. And for me, or it's probably not the only solution, but I think, and this is what we also try to evaluate now, is whether engaging teachers with us in transdisciplinary research can help us to overcome this problem, because then they don't need to know everything about evolution, but they know where the expert is to go and look for more information or to support to develop something. And so creating networks that could support teachers could eventually, I'm not sure about this, but again, I feel supporting teachers in their practices could be a way to go, giving them a safe net, and simultaneously, and I learn a lot with teachers, and so it's not a one-way direction, it's two-way directions. And I feel we need to stop thinking only about what should we do with teachers and what should we do, not what should we do for teachers, but what can we do with teachers, and think about this with them. I think we still need to give this step, which I feel it's important if we want these to turn into practices.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because we always talk about what we want to give them to do. And this is something that, of course, has to be discussed with them. So, with Swiss precision, we have reached the end of this webinar. So, Lisa, what should we do now?
So we can say thank you to all of you who were here today, and thank you to Kostas for leading us in this wonderful discussion, exploration. It's really great to have these intellectual conversations throughout the world. It's really appreciated. As I mentioned in the chat, we do have an option for people to attend our conference virtually. You don't have to travel to Canada. So if that's something you're interested in, please check out narst.org. We'll send you a message too. I think Kostas is going to get together a reference list or some resource ideas, and I will send that out to you along with a link to our recording. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much for being here. And again, many thanks to Lisa and Nors for organizing this.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.